But I have to say now, dare I say it, forgive me, you're an artist, you're a great artist. I remember it and I love it, and I love you forever.
She stood on stage decades later and said nothing, but his words cut through the silence. I love you forever. The room froze, because some love stories never truly end. It wasn't a Hollywood fairy tale. It wasn't even a proper love story. If you believe love must end in weddings or white dresses. No, this was something else, something haunting. A connection that defied definition, spanned decades, and left no clear trail except the ache of what might have been. Diane Keaton and Al Pacino, two of cinema's most magnetic forces, didn't just act in masterpieces they lived through one, but it wasn't written in screenplays. It was written in silences, missed chances, and the spaces between their words. When Al Pacino looked at Diane during that unforgettable moment at the AFI Lifetime Achievement Awards and said, I love you forever, it wasn't just an actor delivering a line. It was a man acknowledging the one woman who had waited, loved, and walked away. The applause drowned out the quiet tragedy of it all. A relationship that never had a name. A proposal left unanswered. A love that was always almost. This wasn't the kind of story Hollywood celebrates. No tabloids ran cover spreads. No engagement rings or explosive breakups filled the headlines. Their romance lived in the margins, never quite arriving, never fully leaving. For over 20 years, they returned to each other in ways the world never saw. No red carpets, no declarations, just two artists broken in different ways, trying to hold on without ever fully holding each other. And that's what makes it unforgettable. Because in a city of stories that chase happy endings, theirs was a reminder that love doesn't always need to end in fireworks. Sometimes it ends in stillness, a whisper instead of a bang, a look across a room instead of a kiss. Their connection wasn't just about passion, it was about timing, trauma, and the unbearable weight of wanting more than someone can give. Even now, decades after it all faded from public view, that one phrase lingers. I love you forever. Not because it was romantic, but because it was real. It was late, it was broken, and yet it was everything. To understand how they reached that unforgettable moment, we have to return to the very beginning, long before the cameras ever rolled. Before love, there were scars, and these scars shaped how they loved and how they lost. Diane Keaton wasn't born into glamour. She was born into a house where silence swallowed ambition. Her mother, Dorothy, had once dazzled in a small-town beauty pageant, her eyes full of dreams and stage lights. But all of that was buried under laundry piles and quiet dinners. Diane watched her mother become a shadow of who she might have been, a radiant soul tucked away in a kitchen, smiling through disappointment. And from that silence, Diane made a vow. She would never be that woman. She would be loud, free, uncontainable, a woman no man could cage. But deep beneath that defiance lived a quieter longing, a dream she never fully admitted. She didn't just want freedom. She wanted love that stayed. Not the kind of love that flickered in applause or faded after curtain calls, but one that held her when no one was watching. Al Pacino, on the other hand, was born to survive. Raised in the chaos of East Harlem, his life began with an empty seat at the table. His father walked out when he was just 2. His mother, Rose, struggled to keep them afloat in a Bronx apartment too small to hold dreams. Al didn't grow up watching love. He grew up watching fear, fear of not making rent, fear of failure, fear of being stuck. While Diane saw a woman held back by family, Al saw family as the very thing that could trap a man forever. That contrast would become the quiet fracture in their story. Diane craved roots. Al ran from them. By the time they reached adulthood, their emotional blueprints were carved deep. Diane had become magnetic, witty, utterly unafraid to stand alone, but still aching for something lasting. Al had transformed into a mystery, deep, intense, and unknowable. He found safety in characters, commitment in scripts. But real people, real love? That was too dangerous. It meant being known. It meant being hurt. While Diane leaned into vulnerability, Al armored himself with detachment. And yet, both were artists, Both had tasted the ache of being misunderstood, of wanting more, but fearing it would cost them everything. That shared pain is what would later pull them together. But in truth, they were already marked. Diane chased permanence. Al chased escape. She needed love to stay. He needed love to breathe. It was never going to be simple, because some connections come not to heal but to expose the fractures we thought we buried. And when fate brought them together, it didn't ask if they were ready, it simply watched them collide. They didn't just play lovers on screen. Off camera, something far more dangerous began, a silent love neither could name. When Diane Keaton and Al Pacino first locked eyes in 1971 on the set of The Godfather, they weren't legends. Not yet. They were two rising stars, hungry, vulnerable, unproven. The world around them was chaos. Producers questioning casting choices, studio executives second-guessing Pacino's quiet intensity, and pressure mounting with every take. But amid that chaos, something rare sparked between them. It wasn't loud. It wasn't public. It was a quiet recognition, one soul glimpsing another across a battlefield neither of them truly understood. What unfolded wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't planned. It just happened, silently, inevitably. Diane had never been shy about her feelings. In interviews years later, she confessed she was crazy about him from the start. He was unpredictable, almost aloof, with a presence that made you lean in just to feel closer. There was a lost child in his gaze, something damaged and brilliant that made her want to protect him. But there was also a wall she couldn't scale, a distance she couldn't close. Still, she stayed, not because he asked her to, but because she couldn't look away. Pacino, ever the enigma, didn't speak about her publicly then, but those who were there, those who knew them, saw what was unfolding behind the scenes. There was a pull, emotional, magnetic, and far more intimate than the love story they portrayed on screen. They weren't just acting. They were revealing, inch by inch, pieces of themselves they hadn't shown anyone before. Between them was something fragile, something real, but neither of them dared name it. Their connection grew in the shadows, between rehearsals, over late-night conversations, during quiet moments no one else noticed. It never exploded into headlines. It wasn't built for spectacle. It was intimate, personal, and deeply private. And yet, even as it grew, the cracks were already forming. Diane's heart leaned in with full weight. Pacino's instincts leaned back. She was reaching for permanence. He was guarding his freedom. Still, the bond deepened. Over the course of filming The Godfather, and later its sequels, their story unfolded in silence. They were lovers without labels, bound by something deeper than definition. The kind of connection that didn't need words to be real. But underneath the growing closeness was a tension neither of them could resolve. Diane hoped. Al hesitated, and slowly, what started as possibility began to twist into longing. But while the world saw a rising romance on film, behind closed doors, their story was already beginning to unravel. They never married, but they never stopped returning to each other. For 20 years, love lived in the in-between. What Diane Keaton and Al Pacino shared wasn't loud. It wasn't something plastered across headlines or paraded at red carpet events. It was quieter than that, quieter, and somehow more devastating. For 2 decades, they danced around something they couldn't define, a love that refused to become official, but never truly disappeared. They broke up, moved on, tried again, and broke apart again. But each time they drifted away, something pulled them back. Not obligation, not tradition, just unfinished business. A connection that refused to die. Diane tried, again and again. She loved Al the only way she knew how, with full presence, relentless hope, and a willingness to wait. She dated others, Woody Allen, Warren Beatty, even Mel Gibson, but the shadow of Pacino followed her into every room. She once said, "The Godfather wasn't about Michael Corleone, it was about Al." Everything came back to him, and everyone who knew her understood why. He wasn't just a man to her, he was a mystery she couldn't solve, a wound she couldn't stop touching. Al, for his part, never pretended to be something he wasn't. He was brilliant, brooding, elusive. He kept people at a distance, even those he cared about most. He let Diane in, but only so far. He let her love him, but never promised anything back. He couldn't. Commitment terrified him. Stability felt like a prison. And though he admired her, respected her, maybe even loved her, he was never able to give her what she truly needed: the assurance that he'd stay. Friends noticed. They said only Diane had the grace and grit to handle Pacino. She never pushed, never demanded. She understood his silences and forgave his absences. But love without foundation wears a person down. The years passed, and the cycle repeated: connection, distance, return, regret. It was a romance without a name, a story without a resolution. And though the public rarely saw it, behind the scenes, it was one of the most quietly tragic love stories in Hollywood history. They were never photographed as a couple. There were no shared interviews, no announcements. Their relationship existed in the gaps between films, between partners, between heartbreaks. Diane was always the one who stayed longer, waited harder, believed deeper. And Al was always the one who left first, vanished quicker, feared more. It wasn't malicious. It was instinctual. He didn't know how to belong to someone. She didn't know how to stop trying to be the exception. But in Rome, as they filmed The Godfather Part 3, Diane made one final attempt to write an ending, and that's when everything broke. She gave him one last chance. Marry me, or let me go. He chose silence. And that silence shattered everything. By the time The Godfather Part 3 began filming in Rome, the years had taken their toll. The back and forth, the years of almost, the weight of unspoken promises, they had all begun to crack Diane's resolve. But she wasn't done hoping. Not yet. Staying in the same villa, sharing dinners, walking the same ancient streets, it felt like a full circle moment. The end of the trilogy was near. Maybe, she thought, this could finally be their beginning. After 2 decades of waiting in the quiet, maybe he was finally ready to speak. Everyone around them expected it. Friends, castmates, even the crew could feel it in the air. The way Diane looked at him, the way Al lingered longer than usual in her company. There were no dramatic displays, no grand gestures, but there was tension. The kind that builds before something breaks. And Diane, still full of belief in the love she had carried for so long, did what most wouldn't dare. She asked him. After years of waiting, she asked him to marry her. What she got in return wasn't rejection. It wasn't a fight. It was worse. He said nothing. He didn't argue. He didn't embrace her. He didn't even cry. He just left. Left her with a silence so loud it echoed through every room she had built for them in her heart. That silence didn't just answer her question, it erased the fantasy. In that moment, the years of patience, the sacrifices, the waiting, collapsed into a single truth. He was never going to stay. The timing couldn't have been crueler. Diane's father was dying. She was already drowning in grief. And now, the one man she had loved with unwavering faith had walked away without looking back. She fell into depression. Real, suffocating, soul-dragging depression. Therapy became her anchor, but even then, the pain didn't leave it, just changed shape. She wasn't grieving a breakup. She was grieving a future that never came. She had believed in a version of Al that existed only in fragments, only in hopes. And now, even those had turned to dust. From that point on, something shifted. Diane withdrew from romantic pursuit entirely. There were no more public relationships. No more whispered hopes. The part of her that had waited all those years quietly closed its doors. Not in bitterness, not in anger, but in quiet surrender. She chose solitude. And not because she didn't believe in love anymore, but because she had already given everything. She had to the only man who never asked for it. She let go of him, but never of the love. And what followed was a different kind of commitment. To herself, to her art, and to silence. She never dated again. He never married. But neither ever truly moved on. After Rome, Diane Keaton closed the chapter that had defined the most vulnerable part of her life. Not with anger, not even with regret, but with resignation. The kind that settles in slowly, over time, until it becomes a quiet truth. She never spoke of another serious relationship again, not publicly, not privately. She didn't seek out love anymore, not because she didn't believe in it, but because she had already given the best of her heart to someone who couldn't hold it. And that kind of giving doesn't happen twice. Instead, she poured her energy into something else, something she could control. Her work, her craft, her image. She adopted 2 children, a daughter and a son, both in her 50s. A choice that shocked many, but made perfect sense to those who understood her journey. Diane didn't need a man to define her family or her future. She had become the very thing her mother never got the chance to be, a woman who chose herself completely and unapologetically. Al Pacino, on the other hand, continued living by the rules he had always followed, rules that kept people close enough to feel wanted, but never close enough to stay. He had 4 children with 3 different women. None of them became his wife. None of those relationships lasted in the way Diane had hoped theirs might. And while the world speculated about his reasons, those who looked closely saw a man who had spent his life performing roles but never quite learned how to live one fully. Al was always acting even in love. Their lives, strangely, began to mirror each other. Both legends in their own right, both acclaimed, revered, and admired, yet both alone. Not lonely, perhaps, but undeniably solitary. The connection they once had didn't flare up again, not in any romantic sense, but it didn't vanish either. They didn't replace each other. No one ever filled that space. They simply moved forward in parallel, aware that something had existed between them that neither fame nor time could erase. And yet, beneath all their silence, something remained. A kind of emotional residue, a knowing. When Diane spoke about Pacino in interviews, her voice would soften, her eyes would linger. She never spoke badly of him, and when Al mentioned Diane, there was warmth, there was respect. There was something that sounded a lot like longing. But even as time distanced them, the world would witness one last moment, a confession so honest, it stunned even Diane. 30 years after walking away, he stood before her and the world, and said the one thing he never could before. The lights dimmed. The room fell silent. It was 2017, and Diane Keaton stood at the center of Hollywood's most prestigious stage, honored with the American Film Institute's Lifetime Achievement Award. Faces that had shaped cinema for decades looked on, applauding her brilliance, her legacy, her independence. But it was one face in the crowd that carried the weight of 3 decades of silence. Al Pacino, her former co-star, her almost, her could-have-been, stepped forward. The air shifted. Everyone in the room felt it. Not just because of who he was, but because of what he might finally say. He didn't deliver a rehearsed speech. He didn't lean on cliches or polished anecdotes. Instead, he spoke of Diane not as a colleague, not even as an icon, but as someone he had known in ways no one else ever had. He recalled moments from Rome, laughter before interviews, glimpses of a woman who had always lived just beyond his reach. It wasn't the words themselves that pierced the room, it was what they carried. Memory, regret, a strange and lingering tenderness. And then, just before he stepped away from the podium, he paused. A long, aching silence followed. And in that moment, with decades hanging in the air like unfinished verses, Al Pacino looked directly at Diane and said it clearly, quietly, and without hesitation, "I love you forever." He didn't explain it. He didn't justify it. He just let the words sit there, naked and impossible to ignore. It wasn't a proposal. It wasn't a plea. It was a confession too late to change the past, but too powerful to keep buried. The room exhaled. Diane didn't cry. She didn't collapse into sentiment. She just smiled soft, knowing, and deeply still. Because maybe she'd already cried all the tears there were. Maybe that smile was the only way she could receive something she'd waited a lifetime to hear. But there was no embrace, no rekindling. Just that one final truth. A phrase that echoed louder than any love scene they ever acted together. A sentence. that offered no answers, only acknowledgement. And yet, even this confession wasn't an ending, because the story they lived was never meant to have one. What do you call a love that never begins, never ends, and never truly dies? The story of Diane Keaton and Al Pacino isn't just a Hollywood romance that missed its moment. It's something far more fragile and far more human. It's what happens when two people love each other deeply but differently. Diane, with her open heart and quiet longing, wanted healing. She wanted someone to come home to, someone who wouldn't leave, someone who would stay. Al, on the other hand, needed distance. He needed space to breathe, to survive, to remain unshackled by anything that felt permanent. They stood side by side, close enough to feel each other's heartbeat, but never in sync long enough to live one life together. For all their fame, their awards, their public lives, neither ever filled the space the other left behind. Diane never remarried. Al never committed. The world remembers their names for the roles they played, but beneath the spotlight, they carried a script no one else ever read. It wasn't just about love, it was about how much of themselves they were willing to give up. Diane was ready to surrender, to risk everything for something lasting. Al couldn't do the same, not because he didn't care, but because his love came with conditions, ones that made true partnership impossible. And maybe that's the truth most people overlook, that some love stories aren't built to survive, not because they're weak, but because they're too complex, too intense, too full of contradiction. Their relationship became a reflection of what happens when the timing is always just a little off, when what one person calls home, the other calls a trap. Diane wasn't asking for the impossible, she was asking for certainty. And Pacino, haunted by a childhood of instability, couldn't give her what he never had. That kind of gap doesn't close with love alone. They each carved their own legacies. Diane, the symbol of fierce, aging femininity without apology. Pacino, the eternal lone wolf of American cinema. But even with decades between them and relationships that came and went, neither ever erased the other from their life narrative. That's what made their story timeless. Not its resolution, but its lack of one. They remained suspended in a strange emotional space. Not together, not apart, not over. And maybe in the end, Diane didn't love the wrong man. Maybe she just loved the right one at the wrong time. Or maybe, as she once admitted, she was drawn not to who he was, but to what he represented. A broken soul she hoped love might fix. But love doesn't heal what doesn't want healing. And Al, for all his admiration and affection, never said he'd change. He simply loved her in the only way he knew how, from a distance. Because maybe love isn't about staying, it's about who still whispers your name, even when the world has gone quiet. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.